What is photosynthesis? Photosynthesis is the process plants use to convert the sun's energy into glucose. The reactants are CO2, water, and sunlight, and the products are O2 and glucose. As you will see later on, cellular respiration is the exact opposite. For photosynthesis, there are two steps. First is the light-dependent reactions. The second is the Calvin cycle. So before we get started, first let me show you a picture of the chloroplast, the organelle where photosynthesis takes place. These are the thylakoid discs, which contain chlorophyll, and this is the stroma. First of all, how do plants get their reactants? The sun is the major source of energy for life. Plants contain chlorophyll in their thylakoid discs in their chloroplast. Chlorophyll is the green pigment that absorbs sunlight. How do plants get CO2? At the bottom of each leaf, there are openings called the stomata. These control the amount of gas exchange, for example, the amount of CO2 that goes in and the amount of O2 that comes out. Water goes in through the roots. Then by active transport of minerals and water following by osmosis, it travels up the xylem. The stem has two parts, the xylem, which controls the stuff that goes up, and the phloem that controls the stuff that goes down. First process is the light-dependent reaction. Sunlight excites electrons in the thylakoid disc. Water is then broken down to H+ protons and O2, which is later let out through the stomata. In this case, oxygen is waste, also called a byproduct. The electrons then traveled through the ETC, the electron transport chain. The electrons then travel through the ETC, the electron transport chain. Proton pumps on the thylakoid membrane pump protons into the thylakoid space. Protons flow through the ATP synthase. As a result, energy is created, allowing the transformation of ADP into ATP. Extra electrons are picked up by NADP+ electron carrier and becomes NADPH. This is the end of the first process, the light-dependent reaction. The second process is the Calvin cycle. This is when the plant actually starts making sugar. Energy is used from ATP and NADPH to combine CO2 to make glucose. By breaking the bond between the second and third phosphate, ATP becomes ADP Next again. Is cellular respiration. The purpose is to convert glucose to usable form of energy, also known as ATP. The reactants are glucose and oxygen, and the products are CO2, water, and ATP. For cellular respiration, there are three steps: glycolysis, which happens in the cytoplasm, Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and ETC, also known as electron transport chain. The last two happen in the mitochondria. Let's start with reactants. Oxygen gets into our bodies through breathing and diffusion into our cells. Glucose, your favorite, gets in through by eating foods like ice cream, pizza, apples, and all this other yumminess. First off is glycolysis. The purpose of glycolysis is to split glucose into small enough pieces so it can enter the mitochondria. The result of glycolysis is 2 ATP, NADH, an electron carrier, and 2 pyruvic acids. A pyruvic acid is a 3-carbon molecule. Pyruvic acid then proceeds and loses 1 carbon to equals 2 CO2. 2 CO2 meets with coenzyme A, which then becomes acetyl-CoA. During this process, energy is created. This process is called pyruvate oxidation. Acetyl-CoA then goes into Krebs cycle, and it breaks down CO2, which is the base of glucose. Higher energy electrons charge NAD+ to NADH, FAD+ to FADH2, and ADP NADH to ATP. And FADH2 bring high energy electrons to the ETC. Electrons on the ETC activate proton pumps, which generate the electrical charge across the membrane. The protons flow back through ATP synthase to convert ADP to ATP. As electrons go down the ETC, they release energy, so a lot of ADP is converted to ATP. Fermentation is the last process. Fermentation occurs when oxygen is unavailable. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor. Fermentation recycles NADH to NAD+. This is so glycolysis can continue. 2 types of fermentation is lactic fermentation that we get, and alcoholic fermentation that bread, yeast, and bacteria get. This is it for today. Thank you.